So, SingularityNET community event. This is actually part 3 of a 4-part talk. The first part was looking at humanity and technology and how did we get to where we are. Ultimately, we talked about that technology is a natural inbuilt progression of being a human being and using tools to make better tools. So, for example, as I give each event, that if you have discovered flint, you can make an axe that can cut down trees, that can make rafts, and that progression of technological change has brought us through, right the way through to the modern era. That was the first event. The second event, we focused on looking specifically, in fact I'll go through here, look, humanity and technology. Oh, I did that, just bear with me. My screen's gone black, so I'll reload it. So the second event is humanity and technology. You know, how do we get to the singularity? So the technological singularity is a point in time where that progression of technology increases, so in speed. So the abilities of our tools that we make are exponentially more powerful than the tools that we had before, and that progression throughout time leads us to a point by which technological change is happening at such a rate that it is impossible for us as a species to really understand the impact that has on society. Now, to say is that this particular event, hi Charles, do you mind moving away from the screen please, so that others can see it, if you'd be so kind. Thank you very much. A bit further if you wouldn't mind. So, yeah, this particular event is looking at societal changes. So, what are the implications of technological change, on society? So, we really need to work out, first of all, what exactly is a society. So, it's quite an interesting question because, we talk about society all the time, but what actually is it? What exactly is a society? Well, a society is composed essentially of a number of people who live together within defined territories and share a common culture. Now, when we say share a common culture, in history, of course, cultural invasion was considered an invasion, so the borders of a culture were very self-contained. So if another culture was to encroach on that territory, it was considered, quite an act of violence and was treated, quite violently. Of course, today we progressed quite significantly, and now we have multicultural societies where there are lots of different types of culture living together in relative harmony. I mean, obviously, there are certain circumstances where there's cultural clash, but ultimately, we live relatively peacefully. Societies become more complex as a means, basically, over time. Societies work together, so it's collaborative work and working together to solve subsistence problems, so problems that societies face, to do with survival. So, the earliest civilizations and the earliest sorts of problems that societies came across was, how to feed themselves, how to shelter themselves, how to deal with the sick, and what have you. So, but the way that societies dealt with that was through technological advance. So they have come across a particular problem or an uncomfortable part of their life, which they then were trying to make better somehow through the use of technology. So this progression is continuous throughout time, and in actual fact, is the root cause of technological change. Necessity is the mother of all invention. And for example, a way for food, perhaps food would go off very quickly, so they need to find some way to make that food last longer. So they invent some way to do that, and this is the kind of technological advance. So societies become more complex over time. So, but there's actually different types of society through time based upon technological advance. So we have right at the beginning, you know, the foraging. So really very little knowledge, very little technological advance. Just literally foraging for food, not really using much intelligence to do that. Pastoral and horticultural, so the use of very basic tools to actually obtain food, shelter, you know, heat and warmth, through to agricultural society, whereby we learn to use tools to till the land. Yes, Ben, we will ask questions a little bit later if you may. Yeah, the horticulture and agricultural societies basically learn to use tools to obtain better, you know, resources from the land, and particularly from an agricultural society, allowed civilizations to grow quite large, because you know you're able to feed a lot more people. And able to deal with larger sums of people, which brought societies together in ever greater numbers. Then we have this line, which is the Industrial Revolution, which is a major change in society. And if you think of technological change as being an exponential curve for millennia, very little seemed to happen in terms of the total amounts of change, or the difference between society, you know, between the ages wasn't that great until we get to around the Industrial Revolution, whereby tremendous amounts of change happen, you know, and technology such as irrigation and sanitation, which you know, was invented by the Romans, you know, 2,000 years ago, could be expanded and mechanized and brought to the masses in such a way that you know, cities could be created that were relatively disease-free. You know, we all understand the fire of London, for example, occurred because there was a fire. The houses were very close together and built from wood, but they couldn't put it out because they couldn't get the water from the Thames to the fire fast enough. So all of these kinds of technologies were born from the Industrial Revolution. Steam power you know, really sort of pushed us forward. And then we have a post-industrial society. So this is where we are today. So post-industrial is where we employ a lot of automation, things like you know, sort of computing and you know, being able to fly, all these kinds of technologies in a post-industrial civilization. So now, in terms of, and I know I'm talking about civilization quite a bit, and it's quite important really, because to understand what's happening and the impact technology has on society, it's really quite important to understand why technology and what's actually happening, what's the picture of the technological change. Now, we have something which is called a Clark sector model, which is an economic theory really. It's a hypothesis that provides a description of activities that are essential to all civilizations. You know, these particular types of different activities are broken down into four main parts. So you've got primary, which is the resource extraction, so that's taking raw material from the ground. Secondary is processing that raw material into useful forms, and you know, so for example, if you were to extract ore from the ground would be a primary activity. Secondary might be turn that ore into iron, or steel, rather, or bronze, in what have you. So moving forward in terms of the technological change, taking a resource and then turning it into something else. And we've got the Teteri, which is a service provision. So this is more to do with the actual kind of service provision. So doctors, teachers, these kinds of things really. So they're really all the kinds of services that you would expect a civilization of a certain size to need really. And then we've got quaternary, which is research and development and scientific knowledge and basically researching science and technology. So what over time and from the terms of a civilization, through the history of the world, this graph shows broken down into three parts. So you've got pre-industrial, industrial and post-industrial. And as you can see at the top here, this is a percentage of time employed in that particular activity from a production point of view. So, and over the bottom is the time. So in a pre-industrial environment and in civilization, the majority of people are actually conducting primary types of activities. So they're not really doing much apart from taking raw material from the ground. There is a little bit of turning that into workable material. So let me just explain the lines a little bit. So the green is the primary, the blue is the secondary, the pink is the service-led Teteri, and this purple one at the bottom here we'll talk about in a minute is the quaternary. So so in a pre-industrial environment, you're looking at the majority of the time that people took doing activities for the civilization was in the primary sector. And then as we move through time into the industrial area and time frame, we have a crossover period, okay? So that's where we move from doing predominantly primary types of activities, taking coal from the ground, taking raw materials. And there's a crossover whereby actually there's more industrial, more activity going on than primary. And the amount of services that we use and require goes up. And this is a growth caused by a number of factors, but a primary factor really is the volume of people within that society living together within that territory that actually need certain things. And so services goes right, as I mentioned earlier, in doctors, nurses, school teachers, but also civil servants and structures of government and governmental control starts coming in. As we move to a post-industrial era, we get this really kind of strange situation. Now, from the crossover in the industrial era, we get this kind of the difference in change between the primary and secondary kind of stays the same, although both are in decline. We realise that obviously there's limited amounts of resources, so we start to look at more efficient ways of using the resources that we've got, and we start looking at recycling at this point. We start to look at how to be more efficient effectively with what we've got. So both the secondary and the primary come down, although we're actually conducting more secondary services than primary at this point. The number of services that we offer actually peaks at this point, and in some cases declines. And as we move past this line to even post-industrial, to where we are in terms of an information age, we expect that this will actually fall as well in terms of the activities that humans do as automation takes over. And we've got now this really interesting line down here. This is the quaternary. Okay, so throughout the whole of history, very little quaternary research has been taking place. There has been some. I mean, obviously, if we look throughout history, you know, we have great thinkers and we have great scientists, you know, throughout history. But they're so small in terms of the overall activity of humanity that it doesn't even register on the line, and it doesn't register until we get to a post-industrial era, mostly down to the fact that the information itself takes time to register and takes time to you know, be spread and cast around and understood. But yeah, so in this post-industrial area, the quaternary, which hardly seems to register, takes off. Now, that's the real interesting bit, because on this next slide, this is the quaternary line. So we have, this is where we're at. So in terms of the growth in world population at the side here, and time across the bottom, okay? So there isn't the selection here in terms, you can't see the time, which is unfortunate, but where it juts up, so from this point onwards, where the line juts up, that's about 1920, and right at the 0 point, that's about the agricultural revolution, so quite a long time ago. So in 1920, there was, actually 1920 is about there, on this. So we're at about 2 billion people on the planet. Okay. By about 1960, we'd gone to 3 billion, and obviously right the way through to today, we're at 7 billion. So quite an exponential growth. But this is the quaternary line. So as you can see, the agricultural revolution, pottery was invented, mathematics, you know, writing, all these things, you know, barely register massive technologies on their own, in their own right, but it wasn't until we have a growth of people that we start getting, you know, the industrial revolution, and it starts to rise exponentially over time. So the total number of life and civilization changing technologies occurs at such a rate that the line literally goes directly up. It's an exponential line. It goes up like that. So so if I go to the next slide. So what's actually causing right now in terms of technology, right? So we're getting to a point where there's convergence, right? Which brings us to a point where we can actually automate many of the tasks that we previously had to do manually. Okay, this is where all of those technologies are leading us to. So if we go back to the last slide, you know, this here, we're looking at, you know, all of these are converging. They're converging on a point whereby we can automate many of the things that you know, we couldn't do before. So automation, obviously, you know, isn't new. I mean, it's not a new phenomenon at all. You know, it's a factor of applied technology to make a task easier. A good example, in fact, is you know, the invention of, say, the windmill. You know, it automated the process of grain. It's very simply. You know, so automation is something which is going to come in as a result of the quaternary research and the exponential growth of that from a societal point of view. So, but you know, in terms of automation, you know, a lot of people said, well, why do we need automation? What's the purpose of automation? You know, well, automation basically overall reduces the operating costs of an enterprise or a process. It actually improves the production output. You have less human error. There's less waste, typically, because of a lack of human error. So you have an increase in production. It is overall improved health and safety. You know, the less human hands touch something, the less chance there are that they can be hurt. Production quality can improve because you can make something the same every time You know, that goes without saying. It says reduce production downtime. Now, this is debatable. It's good when it works. It's not good when it doesn't work. And of course, reduced labour, and so therefore reduced labour cost. So from a business point of view, you know, where most of the technological advances coming from today is from enterprise and the race to make more and be better and generate more revenue. So automation is actually something which is happening and is happening around us, has been happening for a long time. This is actually now coming to the forefront. So we have about something like Amazon, for example. We have a warehouse situation. So Amazon obviously started many years ago as just simply a book retailer, an online book retailer in a single warehouse, you know, just distributing books. From there, they progressed on and provided, you know, electronic copies of books and expanded from there to the point where they're one of the largest companies in the world today. And you know, the amount of space and the operation size is so huge. I mean, they were employing such a vast number of staff to you know, pick items and ship them out. But it's an incredibly low-level job. It's a boring job, terrible wages. People did it because they needed the work, but ultimately it's a terrible job. Lots of mistakes were made. Amazon was pulled down quite badly for the way in which they treated their staff. And their solution was to increase profitability and reduce the amount of complaints, was to replace the staff with automation. So currently there's around 80% of warehouses manually operated and have no means to automate. In 2016, however, the logistics robotic market had increased from 1.9 billion, and we're estimating in 2021 a recent study basically suggested that the revenue for the sector would increase to 22.4 billion, so 22.5 billion. So Amazon are clearly forerunners of this and will likely ship this out to as many people as possible. So in terms of you know, the total number of robotic units out there, I mean, we're expecting to grow. We're currently at about 40,000 annually. We're expected to grow to 620,000 annually. So Amazon obviously are forerunning logistics. So they basically have these robots. When you go on Amazon and you buy something from there, you know, the actual data that you put in, the order goes through to the internet, into their database system, into the robot, where it's then picked. These little robots zoom around, pick the item, and send it off to a lorry where it would obviously be shipped directly to you. Talking of automated lorries, we have Tesla, who created the Tesla Semi, which is quite an impressive feat. It's an automated vehicle. It's a robotic vehicle, essentially. It's electric. Has a range up to 600 miles, so it was quite a feat. Can tow 36 tons, and is claimed that it can hit 0 to 60 in 20 seconds. I mean, that's not a Ferrari, but when you think it's carrying 36 tons, that's actually quite a feat. There's a lot of torque involved in that. So, but why would you know, a logistics company want this? Well, currently, I mean, I'm going to talk in UK pounds, but you can translate this into whatever language or currency you like, but you will get the idea. So currently, it costs about £85,000 to purchase a diesel lorry. And from there, obviously, that's just the lorry, and you have fuel on top of that, and of course the driver to think about. And driver's salary is about £25,000. But those drivers, they're prone to human error. Lots of accidents happen. People die, unfortunately, on the roads every day as a result of falling asleep at the wheel. Lorry drivers themselves, of course, by law, have to pull over and rest ever so often. So it's not really very efficient. But to give you an idea, 85,000, but obviously with 25,000 in the first year. So your first year costs on a lorry in the UK is about £110,000. Ironically, for the 300-mile range Semi from Tesla, the cost of that is actually £110,000. So you would not only make money back after the first year, but you would actually make money back in the first year, because these are automated, they don't need rest. So they will literally go from the distribution centre to the customer and back again with non-stop, and safely as well. So as you can see, it's quite an attractive way of positioning themselves. In fact, so much so that the likes of Walmart, giant Walmart, and several other large companies have already reserved these trucks. So we will be seeing them on the roads. Maybe not now. It's estimated to go into production in 2019. The first ones that roll off the production line will go directly on the roads. So we will be seeing them both in America and the UK and across Europe very, very soon. So we're going, obviously, from the logistics point of view. So if you were to follow that train of thought where Amazon, not necessarily Amazon, but Walmart, were to employ Amazon's way of picking and then Tesla's way of transportation and logistics, you start to see that the supply chain itself is beginning to get automated, okay, completely automated. So, and then, which is great for the consumer, it's great for the customer. It will reduce price and increase efficiency. It's not so good, however, for the worker. We're looking at a point whereby jobs are going to go. Okay, lots of jobs are going to go as a result of automation. Now, as I mentioned, this whole talk is on the sociological effects technology has, technological effects on society. And primary to our society is how we exist on a day-to-day basis. Our lives are set up on going to work, and certainly in the developed world and most of the developing world, we go to work to earn money to be able to pay for our food and our rents and just to survive. So automation is a risk because although it's fantastic, we can do these things and automate these things, and businesses are going to feel the pressure to do it, because if one business is automated, then they're going to take a large chunk of the market because they're suddenly far more efficient than you. So you're going to want to take, as a business, you're going to want to take advantage of the same kind of technology. And so automation will be rolled out as a matter of course. So people are going to lose their jobs. Now, with the advent of artificial intelligence, AI, is going to increase that situation to the point whereby jobs that you would think aren't at risk are going to become at risk. So even, for example, jobs that such as science and engineering and even politics, are going to come under, at risk for automation. In fact, over the next 10 years, it's estimated that, now this is quite a figure, 47% of US jobs and around 40% of UK and European jobs will be automated over the next 10 years. Now just take stock of that for a minute. That's nearly 50% of jobs are going to be automated over the next 10 years, okay? Now that is, it's just so difficult to to really fathom what the implications of that are, what they truly are. So you know, even a higher share of jobs are going to in the developing countries. So China, for example, or you know, these developing countries where there are less skilled jobs, and you know, I'm not necessarily manual jobs. You know, there's a lot of call center and service-led jobs that are there will also be automated. So particularly the impact in developing countries is going to be tremendous. So, I mean, I'm painting quite a negative picture here, but it's not all bad. I mean, I will get to the good, I promise you. So, yeah, so, I mean, this graph here is you know, a look at exactly what's happening in terms of time, where we're actually at in terms of employment. Now, this is taken from the Office of National Statistics for the UK. So this is UK figures, but I can assure you this is a very similar picture to most of the developed world. If you were to pull the report on America, it would look very, very similar. So in 2008, obviously, we had a global downturn. So let me just explain the graph to you. So the black line, this black line ultimately is the country's output GDP. So that is the total gross national product of the UK across the time. So the lines here are essentially the blue lines. The dark blue lines are the number of jobs, so that's the number of people employed, and the light lines are the total average hours that people actually worked. So it's quite an interesting picture, and not something that is difficult to understand. What you've got a situation where in 2008 we had this global downturn, so there was a massive loss of jobs and a massive loss of income, and we recovered around the 2012 mark, and then we saw a reversal whereby there was lots of people in work, but the total output per hour wasn't tremendous. So there was lots of people working, but we didn't increase the output by a tremendous amount, and in fact in some cases the total number of hours, although they increased from when people lost their jobs, they hadn't really grown a great deal, you know, in terms of change from 2012. So we've basically remained static in terms of the number of hours. So, but from a government's perspective, this is great. They love this. You know, they report on these kinds of figures all the time. You know, this government has reduced the unemployment rate by, you know, tremendous amounts, and that's a fantastic thing, right? Well, it is obviously good that people are working, but what's driving this, you know, what's behind this is something called zero-hour contracts. Now, oops, gone over here. So zero-hour contracts are essentially, traditionally, they're the kind of jobs that you would have if you went to an employment agency. So, you know, temporary jobs. These are usually jobs that are taken by either the quite young or in-between jobs where, you know, you're in between a job. And that's how they were used, and you know, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, if I'm completely honest. I mean, if employment agencies didn't exist, of course, then employers would have to employ, but they exist because it's cheaper for employers to employ that way, and it's easier to do it that way. But what we found is, and interestingly, around the recovery point, so hold on. Hello, how are you doing? Bear with me. So around the recovery point at 2012, so at this, if you go back to here, as you can see, about 2012 we had this recovery, and lots of people went into work. Well, around the same time we had a massive increase in 0 hours. So although people went back to work, they weren't going back to work in permanent jobs. they were going back to work in jobs where they weren't guaranteed an amount of hours. So they didn't know how many hours they were going to do in a week. Now this went both ways. This went either very badly because you needed X amount of money but couldn't earn it because you weren't given the amount of hours you need, or it went the other way where people were then forced, because they were on minimum wage, to work tremendous amounts of hours to earn enough money to survive. So they weren't particularly... Hello. Yes, if you wouldn't mind stepping away, we'll be answering questions at the end. So it was literally a situation whereby the recovery of the employment market was fueled by this zero-hour contract situation. So Arabella, do you mind not doing that? Thank you. And this chart, I'm sorry, I'm probably killing you here with charts, but it's really quite important that we understand this. So this is figures again from the UK, so I'm trying to keep the picture coherent so you can understand that this overall picture has occurred across most of the developed world. The red line is house price growth. It's a bit irrelevant to us today, so we won't need to get involved in that. But the yellow line is actually very important. So just to recap, we've had a massive amount of people going back into work from a recovery from about 2012, a massive increase in the number of zero-hour contracts, but then between 2015 and 2017, and we don't have the figures here for this bit, but it goes downwards, okay, we have this yellow line, which is real household, in terms of real household disposable income. So people were going and doing zero-hour contracts and earning less money. So, but not only that, but inflation was rising. So people had less money in their pockets, which is a terrible situation to be in if you imagine it. I mean, you've lost your job, you're being forced into a temporary job where you've got no guarantee of how many hours you're going to get. You don't know how much money is coming in at the end of the month. And this problem is going to be exacerbated. You may not even have that job because your job can be automated. It's a terrible picture, and it's one that many people worry about greatly. In fact, it's been a picture and a worry for quite some time. Okay, so even in the 1950s, Einstein said it has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity. So we're increasing the rate of our technological growth, but we're unable to keep up with it. So in terms of sociologically, in terms of politically, we're unable to keep up with the pace of change. So whereas right the way back where I mentioned the first types of civilizations, it was necessity was driving technological change, and so societies were coming across subsistence problems about existential problems for the society to remain coherent and together, and so therefore we're coming up with technological solutions to those problems, to where we are today, where we're on a runaway curve, exponential growth in technological change, and our ability to both understand that change and do something about that change and understand where it's going is becoming particularly difficult. So Brexit is a fantastic example. Okay, although that's not a technology. Whatever your personal view is on Brexit, there are people who believe it was a good thing. There are people that think that it's a bad thing. But it was very divisive and decisive for the country, for the UK. But I don't think either side could really say for 100% sure that leaving or staying was a good thing or a bad thing. There was no way for them to know what the repercussions of that change would be. Ultimately, the lines were fought on sovereignty and on the right to choose, which people wanted to feel that they have the right to make a decision. But ultimately, there was no real way to understand it. So this is actually where we're at in terms of our technological change and our society. So our technological change over time is growing at such a rate that it is outstripping our ability to deal with from a sociological point of view. Our businesses are notoriously bad at picking up technology, although I mentioned earlier that businesses often drive new technology, which is very true, but also inversely they're incredibly bad at implementing and taking up new technology. I'm not sure if any of you remember a few years ago what the WannaCry virus, which affected the world in such some major institutions such as the NHS in the UK and some major government institutions around the world were affected by this. Was it a lapse in security? Well, it was actually caused by the simple fact that these organisations had been using legacy operating systems, that had vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities, that these hackers could take advantage of. So we're not, technological change is happening and outstripping our ability to deal with. Now, this subject is ginormous, it's massive. Okay, so it is impossible, it is absolutely impossible for me to talk with you about all of the possibility, all of the implications, not least because of the subject is so wide and so deep, but also because we don't know. We simply do not know, all of the implications. And one of the reasons why we think having artificial intelligence and certainly looking to help to get artificial general intelligence is a good thing, is because we need to be able to analyze these large sets of data and make decisions quite quickly on these large sets of data on how we proceed. So when we get to the point whereby there is a decision that needs to be taken, such as Brexit, that we have no idea of what the repercussions really are, we need an artificial intelligence to be able to look at that and say to us, well, if you do this, these will be the outcomes likely. If you do this, these will be the outcomes likely. So, but from a governmental point of view, as I mentioned earlier, governments are going to, need to be automated as well. And in fact, there's quite a few quite clever, we have the political ideological, norms of today, where we have the left, the right, and the middle. But there are so many other forms of governmental structure that take advantage of it and take into account technological change. I mean, we have the noocracy, the cyberocracy. We have an AI singleton type of setup where we're being literally run by a singular AI. My personal view is that technological change is going to happen so quickly that we're going to get to the point where we just simply aren't going to be able to deal with it fast enough. So the types, if we were to, I mean, look, today, on average, an election occurs every 4 to 5 years, depending on where you're from. So as technological change happens, I mean, if you think about what was the technological landscape 4 years ago, I mean, it's entirely different today, and so, we really are going to be forced into a situation where there is a great deal of disruption. So, in terms of that, we need to ultimately, this is going to be quite a short-term problem. And the reason why it's a short-term problem, it's a big problem, don't get me wrong, it's a massive problem, but it's a short-term problem because once we if we've got, taking the example of automation earlier, if we can automate, right, all elements of a supply chain, so not just the supply chain, but every element that humans require to survive, right, then we don't need to work at all, right? We don't need money I mean, if you think about this, if energy generation is automated, if maintenance is automated, logistics and transportation, automated, food production, automated, any production of manufacturing products, automated, if all of that is automated, right, things are just being created and generated, and the technologies behind that exist. I mean, today, I mean, we have 3D printing, and which can solve, and although the resolution is very crude, a lot of that can solve, you know, we don't need manufacturing in the same way anymore. I mean, plastic extrusion is a massive business today, and very expensive and very energy intensive, and very wasteful. You know, all of that, you know, to produce, say, a plastic chair, which if you had a 3D printer, you know, you could produce yourself if you had one of sufficient size. In fact, there's 3D printings now that can print whole houses. I know it sounds quite outrageous, but it's true. And the resolution by which those technologies are able to print is going to increase exponentially to the point whereby we can print anything. Recycling of, you know, we create massive amounts of waste as a civilization. If we can 3D print to a decent level, you know, we can also recycle the material, you know, so we will no longer be wasting things quite so much. So we get to a place where we want to get to, which is ultimately a time of abundance. Okay, so the current financial socio-economic paradigm, you know, is relying on scarcity. So it relies on, you know, there being more of resource in one area and basically not enough to go around. In some cases, you know, there's a great abundance of something, but it's still, you know, maintained by a central organisation for wealth purposes and distributed very unevenly. In fact, 50% of the world's wealth is managed by and owned by just 1% of the world's population. The distribution of wealth is just completely wrong, and but this causes most of the upheavals of society, and based upon the fact that we have a financial socio-economic system, you know, so what we need to get to is a post-scarcity world, and that is a time when all of the primary requirements are available to humanity. So we're looking at, you know, all of your food requirements, all of the energy requirements, you know, all of clothing and what have you. All material things can be provided in great abundance. And this is where we want to try and get to. But once we get to there, right, nobody needs jobs. But there's this problem. Okay, so how do we get there? Okay, we have this problem of decreasing work due to automation, but the financial pressure to survive still exists, and you know it's a major problem. So how do we actually deal with that? Well, one solution is UBI, so Universal Basic Income. I'm not sure if you people have understood what that is or have heard of it before. It's a type of program in which citizens of a country may receive a regular sum of money from the government. Okay, so it's not a new idea. It's actually quite an old idea and was kick-started, you know, way back in philosophical history. Was popularised and written about by Thomas Paine, who lived in the last part of the 18th century, and was revitalised in the 20th century by economists and philosophers such as Milton Friedman and James Tobin and Martin Luther King. Ultimately, what it is, it's a periodic payment of money which is usable to the citizens of that country and is paid to each individual. It's not paid to a household. It's a universal payment to everybody. It isn't means tested, so at the moment we have a welfare state. Most welfare states exist within the developed world, you know, which are means tested. But you know, so if you earn a great deal of money, you don't get it. If you earn not very much money, you get it, which seems quite fair. but it's means tested as well. So if you have one child, the state says that X amount of money is means tested, that is the right amount of money, but of course your personal circumstance and requirement might be different to that. But and it's unconditional, so universal basic income is given completely free without conditions whatsoever. So I will just skip that. So it's actually, there's been quite a few pilots of universal basic income across the world. In fact, you know, it's one of those things whereby you can't just implement it. You have to have a case study to understand what the implications are, and there's quite a few, you know, pilots that exist around the world, and quite a few planned as well. I don't know if any of you are from Scotland, but if you are, then you should be looking into this because there's one planned. In fact, one of the factors of doing a rollout of programs like this in small geographical areas is that there's a migration of people who obviously look to take advantage of it. So this really needs to be a universal thing, ultimately. So I mentioned Martin Luther King earlier. He said, "I am now convinced that the simplest approach will prove to be the most effective," or Occam's razor, right? The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a now widely discussed measure, the guaranteed income. So it's been in popular culture for quite some time, and you know, it was put to bed and wasn't talked about for a long time because of capitalism, and you know, even though it and we need to talk about the types of sociological, political vision for UBI is quite interesting because, you know, on the surface of it, it might look like it's a social, you know, scheme. So, you know, it sounds like it might be communism, right? Everyone gets a chunk of money. You know, it's about equality, but ironically, and this isn't just a communism thing, this happens also in democracy, that economically there is a line by which it is very difficult for citizens to get over. Okay, so the social system and the political system that exists across the developed world in particular, but also exists in the developing world as well, probably more so, but in a different format. But ultimately, the political system has a line by which the majority of the citizens cannot economically get across. So, and this is a form of oppression. Okay, so it makes, and what they do with the welfare state is try and top you up to a line. Okay. Now the issue with that is that the line itself is very different for each individual, and the line is very different for each country. So, you know, it's quite a difficult thing. So, communism in particular, you know, looks to create equality by oppressing its people to be, you know, to not be able to rise above an economic line. Universal basic income is entirely different. Because universal basic income isn't saying that. What it's actually saying is that there is a line by which you cannot drop below, that you should not drop below. So it's saying that there is a baseline by which every citizen, regardless of who they are and what they do in life, should have the right to a certain level of liberties and freedom. So those are, you know, you should be able to not worry about food, shelter, you know, basic sustenance. Those things should be a human right. We shouldn't today have to worry about where the next meal is coming from, okay? And this is being increasingly more of a concern given the fact that jobs are going, right? So how do we deal with the fact that you're losing your job? Well, if you had universal basic income and you were receiving a chunk of money enough to pay for your rent and your food, and you lost your job, you'd still survive. But if you were still working, you'd still get the money. They wouldn't stop the money. Currently, if you lose your job, you'll get some money. But if you start working, they take it off you. So in fact, in some cases, it's terrible. You know, they take it off you in stages. So what happens is, just say in the UK we have a tax credit. So it tops your salary up to a certain level. So if I was on low paid wages and I did some overtime because I wanted more money, actually they would take off you some of the money that they're giving you equal to the amount of money extra that you worked. So you're never any better off, and it's a terrible situation to be in. So in fact, there are some, I mean, it's not all great. Universal basic income has some problems that people have addressed, and this is the whole reason why we wanted to do studies, you know, and pilots around the world to try and test out some of these factors. So, you know, some of the objections that people have given is, you know, we can't do it simply because it costs too much. You know, how can we possibly afford to give everybody just a chunk of money, right? That it might be inflationary, that if we give everybody a chunk of money, that value becomes the new zero because inflation would rise by that. There's other problems such as geographical cost differences. So these exist today already, you know, where you move to one area, the cost of living is higher than another. And obviously that causes migration and problems such as that. But also the people won't, you know, do unattractive jobs. But to be honest, this one is being dealt with because obviously automation will take care of that. There won't be those kinds of unattractive jobs that exist anyway. You know, there's a group of people that said we shouldn't do it because it would make people lazy, that they won't work. And as I'll show you, one of the pilots actually that isn't the case. I mean, if we were to give you a chunk of money which was just enough for you to survive, you would be thinking to yourself, well, how do I, you know, I want to build a business, or I want to go to university and learn a new skill. I have the freedom to do that, or you know, I want to still work, and that money that I'm working for will, you know, pay for a big holiday. You know, so people in general. People don't tend to just sit. I mean, there are a portion of people that sit on their butt and do nothing all day, but in general, human beings aren't like that. You know, they want to do something. And as much as you think you might do, after 2 or 3 weeks of sat around doing nothing, you'd be pretty bored. You would be very bored, and you would want to try and entertain yourself. So, you know, there's other problems as well, and, you know, is it a fringe idea? You know, there's no political support, and, you know. But actually, I can promise you this, mark my words here, universal basic income is going to be a major talking point at the next major elections in your country, I promise you. Okay, this will be what the next election, one of the major things that the next election will be fought upon. You know, and we have to be very careful, I'll admit, very, very careful, because you know, it's quite a buzzy thing, so and it is required. But just simply saying that you will deliver universal basic income doesn't necessarily mean that they will, and so I would, you know, act cautiously. So the big one, really, out of all of those, the big one is how do we pay for it? Because if we can't pay for it, it's not even possible, right? Well, it turns out that in certainly the developed world, that the existing welfare programs that exist are quite, you know, in fact, very bureaucratic. So the size of these departments and the cost of these welfare departments are huge. So, for example, I don't know, what's he doing up there? Don't do it. Don't jump. Okay, so yeah, so I mean, the size of these departments is ginormous, and in cost it's terrible. I mean, it costs literally billions and billions and billions. And if you imagine the kind of packages that exist, I mean, the kinds of things like, welfare for jobless and for the people who are sick, it's welfare state, pensions, all of these different things, and they're calculated individually. So there's a lot of department work that needs to go into that. So most of the UBI can be paid for by taking out all of these bureaucratic departments that don't need to exist, because if everyone's getting exactly the same chunk of money, you don't need a massive team of people to administer that. It can be automated, of course. So, but there's also a number of other benefits, and I'll show you on the pilot in a moment. But the number of other benefits to UBI. So, for example, it does eradicate poverty. So homelessness and poverty become, very, very slight as a result, because regardless of who you are, I mean, if you're a citizen, you get a chunk of money. So the person that was begging on the street before now suddenly finds that they can house themselves, they can feed themselves. So there's a massive reduction in costs on the government in terms of health department costs, and there's a massive decrease in crime because people no longer need to steal; they've got chunks of money. But there's a whole host of different things. So it turns out that if we put all of these things together, we can actually afford to do it. So the financial element is possible, but that's true in a developed world, okay? It's not quite so true in a non-developed world, and so this needs to be a global program, okay? So there are countries that could take advantage of this, but ironically, the developing countries, because of the way in which their economy works, the cost to deliver UBI in those countries is reduced exponentially, simply because the conversion rate of money and the way in which their economy works. So we have examples of a pilot, and there are many pilots, but this one in particular I wanted to share with you. So between 2008 and 2009 this pilot existed, and it was a pilot which was put together by the church and by the German government, who helped two poor villages in Nambia. As you can see from the picture, I mean, this particular place, Omitara, it's very run down. The people there living in extreme poverty, and the literacy was dreadful, and people just basically, died a lot of the time through lack of, health and education. The crime was terrible. So they implemented for 1 year universal basic income, and they delivered equivalent of 80 Nambian dollars a month per person for a year, and the results were outstanding. I mean, basically, it reduced child malnutrition and increased school attendance, and enabled the citizens to. And this is beyond what. We were talking about. One of the objections to UBI is that the idea that people will sit around and do nothing. Why would you go to work if you're just getting a chunk of money? Well, what they found in Nambia was quite the opposite. That citizens were partaking in more productive economic activities. They were basically taking the money that was given them, and rather than just spending it and wasting it, they were spending it on building new businesses for themselves and creating a better environment and a better ability to sustain themselves. In fact, in 2012, they went back and they found that the results and the benefits of this study, which only occurred for a year, were still present in 2012. So, 3 years later, the citizens were still, gaining the benefits from this, and this was just for 1 year. So one of the things was crime rate fell by, as I mentioned earlier, crime rate falls, but the overall theft fell by 63%. People didn't feel the need they needed to steal. There was no necessity to steal. So it was a very, very positive thing. Now, some of you might be saying, yes, but that's in a place where extreme poverty exists, and we should be helping those people. This is a way to help those people genuinely. But there is very different pressures on the Western and the developed world. We're losing our jobs, so we could end up in a situation, maybe not quite like that, if we haven't got something in place to actually deal with that. Okay, the governments of the world are going to have to put in place something. If not UBI, it's going to have to be something, simply because the welfare systems that are in place are directly in relation to the amount of income tax that particular government is taking in. So if you have, and this is over the next 10 years, almost 50% of your workforce losing their jobs, you're in a situation whereby you simply do not have enough money coming in, right, if the current economic situation is the same, right, to pay for it. So they are going to have to resolve this. They are going to have to make these changes to be able to afford to pay for it. So that's that part. So this basically, as I mentioned earlier, right, is a short-term solution. So we hope, and where we're trying to get to is a place called utopia. Now, utopia might sound like complete fantasy, and it's written about in science fiction, and it's often very difficult for humans to accept that this could be the case. But this is giving you a little bit of a preview of the next event, where we're going to talk specifically about the technological singularity. But we're in a countdown to utopia. So the problems we've got with people losing their jobs but still requiring financials to pay for the things that they need is on a timeline, and once we get past a certain point we will no longer need the financial system altogether. That has ramifications and implications so far beyond what I can understand and what any of us can really understand. There are very rich and powerful people in the world who are now in decline financially, but have very great desire to try and make sure that they keep and maintain their power base. So I don't understand how and why they're making the moves that they're making at the moment, but certainly the following seems to be true. This timeline is by no means set in stone. This is a rough outline. It could be out by a few years, but the technologies involved in here are absolutely existing at a point and will exist. So just a quick look. We've got passenger drones operation by 2020. We'll have 5G networks by 2020. By 2023, robotics will be commonplace in the household, in middle income earners. What will drive this is smart toys. So most toys will be smart and employs machine learning of some description. By 2025, car ownership will be dead. You will no longer own your car, and automation will have taken over. So we will have an automated car systems, transportation system, and you will order almost like a taxi, but you will order and you'll have different levels of service that you can get. You need to go somewhere, you can jump in a car and it'll take you where you go, and you won't need to drive. Driving, by the way, will still exist. It's not going to disappear altogether. It'll still exist, but it will be a recreational activity and more likely take place inside virtual reality. But I can talk to you a bit about that. There's automated racing cars which are being developed at the moment. We have Formula E, which is an electronic form of car, but in the future, sports and things like that will all happen virtually. So by 2027, hopefully SingularityNET, who I'm a community member of, will have achieved its goal and achieved human level intelligence, AGI. I'm predicting between 2025 and 2027 this will occur. And by 2030, AI will have taken off and exceed human intelligence. I'm predicting that technological singularity is possible at this point. So it might be 2027 to 2030, but something like that, technological singularity. Now, at that point, everything, it becomes unpredictable. If it doesn't happen, it may happen and we may not realize it. It may happen and AI might decide that it wants to keep itself from us for a while. Would certainly be the smart thing to do, I think. Sort of moving on from there, we go to 2032, where we have nanobots, and so that's medical health, increasing longevity, right the way through to where we head into utopia, which is 2038. So we're looking, oops, gone over here. So by 2038, we potentially could be at utopia. So that is really where we're at. So we've got 20 years between now and where I think utopia will be. So it is vitally important that we implement now, right? Because if we don't, it's going to be too late, and we're going to end up in a situation whereby, potentially, it's unfathomable what is actually going to happen, because you're going to end up in a situation where the governments will simply collapse because they can't cope with what it is. And some people are saying that this is the whole purpose of cryptocurrency, right? Well, cryptocurrency potentially could save us, because if we're looking at socio-economic collapse because we can't deal with the technological change that's happening, because it's outstripping our ability in terms of its speed of change, that we already have this safety net platform of cryptocurrency and decentralization in place. And this is why SingularityNET is absolutely critically important, because SingularityNET is actually creating the means by which decentralization of services and automation can be actually rolled out. And the concept of decentralization isn't a new one. It ultimately, decentralization is all about true democracy without a head. So at the moment, sovereignty and democracy moves around. So in the UK, it's a little bit different to most countries because we have a monarchy, but for countries that have a monarchy as well, this is familiar, that sovereignty rests with the people, actually ultimately rests with the Queen, but the Queen in the UK passes sovereignty to the people every 5 years, and sovereignty is then passed to the government within the election, and then at the end of the government is passed back to the Queen. So in terms of political systems, it's a 5-year cycle. We're going to need to change faster than that, and so there's this safety net potentially of cryptocurrency, which hopefully will act to as a go-between, as an in-between. And potentially could be used as a form of UBI scheme, but UBI has to be functional in the country that it exists in. So at the moment, yes, although there are Bitcoin ATMs, you can go and there's a Bitcoin card that you can have, and credit card and what have you, but it's not really very usable properly to most people today. I mean, people that know how to do it can. But most people don't know how. So UBI needs to be accessible by everybody. So politically speaking, it's going to be incredibly difficult for them, and I think that it's really difficult to understand how governments are going to survive. And I think that what will happen is departments will start becoming automated. So individual departments will be automated, and that's the way that it'll go. Ultimately, we want to get to utopia. It's just how do we get there? So this is a vision of utopia. It's very green. We want to get to a point where we're in a sustainable world, right? Where we can live in harmony with the world that we exist in. And, this has been the biggest difficulty of human civilization and society. We have advanced, but often to the detriment of the environment around us. And only in recent years have we even realized that, it's quite important that we need to save the planet as much as we need to save ourselves. And, having domed cities and things like that might be very attractive, but ultimately what we need to do is we need to live in harmony with the world, but we shouldn't cease our progression because of it. We need to be able to increase the amount of energy that we're able to use, to increase our technological change while being in harmony with the planet. Fusion power is one way to deal with the energy part, and by 2024 there will be quite a few projects on the go to build fusion power stations. In fact, there was a breakthrough quite recently in Germany on this, and which I was quite excited about. So, thank you very much for coming. I know it's been quite a long one, and I know it's been almost impossible to actually tell you everything, and to talk about everything. The implications ultimately for technological change are so massively wide that it is impossible to fathom. All we can try and do is cope with the primary things and survive. If we can get through the next 20 years, genuinely we'll be in utopia. And so what we're going to talk about next time, which will be in 2 weeks' time, I think it was the 16th of July, which is also on a Monday, we'll be talking about Singularity and Beyond. So that line I was talking about earlier, gone back right the way back to here. So at this bottom bit, 2030, obviously it's the singularity potentially. So we're going to be talking about that, and that's quite a wild one, because we're going to be talking about things like consciousness and what it is to be alive, and what form singularity might take, and it's a real wild one, and I hope you can make it for that one. And what I'd like to ask you, this is the third of 4 events. There will be more events after this, and because particularly this subject is very wide, I'd love it if you could perhaps email me or message me at the following address, on Telegram, or send me a message here about what you would like to know, because and what you'd like to discuss, and what you'd like the next event to be about after the singularity, because ultimately, this subject is so deep. We need to focus on each area, I think. So if you could perhaps send me that, and we'll look at that. But thank you very much for attending. I will now try and open the floor to questions. Let me just turn up my thing here. So if you've got a question, please stick your hand up. So we've got Alina. Hello, Alina. Oh, hang on a minute. Can I click on you? Oh, hang on a minute. I don't want to do that. Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
I can hear you. How are you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you very much once again for this amazing panel. From last time, I've been thinking about, you were talking about how at one point we will merge with technology, and I
Yes.
was wondering how far are we then away from this? I mean, it's been a big point in our humanity that we will actually get to the point where humans won't die anymore.
Yeah, very true.
I mean, it's a really weird question, but I was just, after the amazing speech from last time, that's been a topic that's been kind of buzzing me.
Okay, yeah. Well, it's a fantastic topic, and actually, we perhaps ought to do a whole event just on that topic. And the ultimate advance of technology is that we already are. I mean, merging with our technology, and you only have to look at your mobile phone, for example. The incredible feats of technology that is, and the abilities that it gives us, and the logical conclusion of that technology, it's external, is that it will enter our bodies and be internal. So back in the early 90s, there was a computer called a Cray 3, and this machine was a supercomputer. It occupied a whole room, and took a whole bunch of power, and it basically cost millions of dollars. And so what's happened is we've got this exponential growth of technology, and so 30 years later we have roughly the same power in a mobile phone. And so because it's exponential, people tend to think, human beings think in a very linear fashion. They think often that if it took 30 years to get to there, then it might take 30 years for it to get small by the same factor. But in reality, it actually, because it's an exponential growth, it takes a quarter of that time. So in just 7.5 years, we'll get down to the point where we're looking at a postage stamp size or a grain size device, which has the same power as a mobile phone. And just 1.5 years later from there, because of the exponential growth of technology, and because the fact that we're able to computate much faster because there's more devices, the cost of that technology has decreased exponentially as well. So there'll be a lot more of them, and so therefore our power to computate increases. And so we get to the point where 1.5 years after that, we get down to the nanoscale. So we're looking at roughly 8 years, 9 years time from now, we will have the ability to have nanobots which can enter our body and to perform a whole number of tasks. First of all, we talk about immortality, and there's been lots of schools of thoughts on this, and in terms of technological advance, of course it's been the goal of humanity for a very long time, but we're actually able to understand it in terms of how it can actually happen today. Some people think that you can scan your brain and create a perfect copy, and when you die, you can recreate that. But that won't be you, of course. That would be a perfect copy, in the same way that a twin isn't you. That's not immortality. That's just a copy. So we need to maintain our consciousness, and there's some very specific questions that we're trying to answer from a philosophical point of view. Is where is consciousness embodied within the human, and that's quite a big question. But ultimately, what I think we need to ensure that we do is we maintain our bodies. So nanotechnology will do lots of different kinds of functions, like travel around your body and cleaning your bloodstream of antioxidants, and that your cells are producing waste all the time, and repair damage that's happening, and keep us looking younger and being younger. But more than that, we'll also be able to colonize areas of the brain and connect us directly to the internet and each other, and a greater space. So our awareness will increase. And it's at that point, where do we find ourselves? I mean, you're in virtual reality right now. I'm in virtual reality right now. My physical body is in the UK, but wherever you are, you're right in front of me as far as I'm concerned. And when I'm thinking about the board behind me, it's there right behind me, but of course it's not really there. But my consciousness and my presence is here, and so I think that we're going to get to the point whereby we need to maintain our physicality, but our awareness can be in multiple places at the same time. And this is, I think, how we're going to achieve immortality. if that answers your question.
No, I mean, thank you very much. It was just something that kind of, with last topic, it kind of started following me around. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Does anybody else have a question? You put your hand up if you have a question. Okay, right. So let's see if I can. Okay, so can I?
Hello.
Hello. Yes, I can hear you. Great.
Yes. Hey.
How are you doing?
Yeah, this was a really great talk. But
Thank you.
the second half, I felt like seems like a little bit too much fantasy, because we are humans. What we live for is fighting for our own survival. So the only way I can see that we can survive is to find a new way to use us as a resource, that we become a new resource. Trying to make us invaluable by giving us money, I don't think that would work. Have you looked into that kind of?
And actually your view is quite common a view, and it's a problem that that we have, because ultimately our entire existence has been a strive to survive, and particularly when you're looking at technological advance, it's not always positive. There are negative sides to technological change, but on the whole, it has been positive. I mean, we've taken technology, and as I gave the example last week, right from the beginning, when there was bows and arrows were invented, you could use them to hunt for food, or you could use them to kill your enemies. There's lots of negative aspects to technology, but in terms of the way in which we think as a species, it's natural and human to think in a linear fashion, and how could this happen? But if you think back to just 2008, the first mobile, the first smartphone was invented, and this was just 10 years ago, and we didn't even have cryptocurrency and blockchain at that point, and it's this, rather than it being something that necessarily we want to do. A lot of us may not want to do this, but it's something that is happening to us. I don't think at this point we can do anything at all to stop it. We're, if you like, I've always used the expression technological singularity to express exactly what's happening with the exponential growth of technology, but I think already at this point we're past the point of the event horizon. Short of a major cataclysm happening, we're already there. Automation is going to be driven by businesses that want to compete. So people are going to lose their jobs, and then there's going to need to be a solution. Although I understand what you're saying, and it's human nature to think that way, but we've got this situation now where we're going to be forced into making decisions that we don't necessarily want to do right now, but ultimately after 20 years it's going to be a benefit. We're going to be having a benefit because we're going to reach to a point where we're in a post-scarcity world. Does that answer your question? Sorry.
Sort of, but the problem I have is that it is what we actually need to do to survive. I agree, but I don't think that we as humans actually think that way, that it would be possible, because we try our best to make our own life better by any means necessary. And in a society, in a system, it's actually the system that creates a bubble that allows a society to work, not individuals. So if you take away individuals, their need to be a part of the society, they will no longer be able to function in it. and that would create more problems than it would.
What we've got here is actually civilization and society is a cohesive and a cohesion of culture and the need for survival. Okay, so what we found right away from the beginning when we were primitives is that it was much easier to survive in groups. Okay, so you know, not just least for the fact that, you know, that we could survive from danger of animals, but also that it was easier for there to be specialism. So there's some people hunting, you know, some people cooking, some people, you know, specialisms. So this is quite a normal way to think, right? And you know, human beings want to have or need to feel like they're worth something, and so it's quite important. But I think that the worth will come from different things and different areas. So at the moment, you know, we feel worthful because you know, we can provide for our families, and you know, we have a civil duty to help build the culture. You know, but I think that as abundance comes in and we get more and more of everything, and we don't need to do those kinds of activities anymore, that, you know, our duties will be to nourish our minds and increase our, you know, the betterment of man. And, you know, we will have the freedom to be able to focus on these kinds of activities more, I think. But I hope that answers your question. Does anybody else have a question? Yeah, anybody? Do we have any more questions? Yeah, oh, we've got a question from John Paul over here. Hello.
Yeah, first I apologize. I'm coming in here a little bit late, so and this is my first time being in your. But it seems like that you're totally taking spiritualism out of the mix here, number one, and which I have a big problem with. And I think there's a lot of things like your timeline. You're speaking in absolutes pretty directly, as if you know these things are going to happen. And it's been my experience as a 60-year-old person that there's been lots of things that have come down the pike that have never seen the light of day, even though they were great ideas and supposedly absolutes of things, you know, things to come. You can take electricity, for instance. You know, it's now taken on many forms, but originally, when the big Edison and the fellow who actually started with static electricity wanted to be wireless, which would have been a great idea. It never really took hold, you know. Yeah, Tesla.
Like Tesla.
You know, so that never took hold. So I think, and it seems to me that you're basing a lot of this on the blockchain, which I put a lot of thought in as well, with the quagmire that can happen, you know, when you start adding money into the equation. It does scare a lot of people, I'm sure, worldwide by now. So maybe you can answer to me what might be the spiritual application that you're talking to, because we are still spiritual beings, and we are, in my opinion, created beings by a God that has our best interest, and the knowledge which can become a dangerous thing, and philosophy becoming a dangerous thing when you start to let your mind wander into such extreme things. You know, you catch what I'm trying to say here?
Yeah,
sure.
Like
you're into philosophy a lot, and been there, done that, and I've resolved to the fact that you know, you have to set your existence either in a spiritual world or in a scientific world, which that's the divisions I see. You know, you have atheism, or you have people who are definitely tapped into spiritualism in one way or another, you know. So
yeah. So okay. So It's a brilliant question. Thank you very much.
Hello.
But first of all, what I'll say is that I mean it is such a massive subject, this, and particularly when looking at spiritualism.
I can't hear. Sorry, there was somebody speaking. I couldn't hear what you were saying. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So what I'm saying. Hi. Okay, so just if you can keep it down, I'm just about to answer a question. So thank you. So basically, I mean, this subject is sociologically, it's such a massive subject, and when I was putting this presentation together, it was becoming incredibly obvious to me as I was researching all the different elements to it that the 2 hours that I'd set aside for this just wasn't going to be enough. I mean, the subjects, each individual subject, it really needs delving into, and the spiritual side of it, and particularly the religious side of it, I didn't touch on, and I didn't touch on that for the purpose that it kind of will be coming into the next event, which is talking about the singularity and the implications of that, because what we're actually talking about is more about the nature of consciousness, and spirituality and consciousness, and where everything, how that all comes together within religion, and what the implications are for the religious, and it's as difficult to understand as the implications for technological advance are on any of the other sectors of society. But if my personal view, I mean, I consider myself to be a scientist in the way that I think, and I study quantum gravity and quantum physics, and so there is a crossover. I know you said you would think either spiritually or philosophically or spiritually and or scientifically, but there is this kind of crossover now whereby we're beginning to understand that the nature of consciousness is actually omnipresent and is a fundamental property of the universe itself. I mean, we're actually made from the universe. We can't separate ourselves from the universe. So we are the universe contemplating itself to some degree. So technological change, I don't think, is against spirituality. I think it's going to heighten our ability to understand spirituality and really know ourselves for who we are, and our relationship to the universe is going to increase, and this is through technological change as well. So I mean, I don't see a disparity between technology and spirituality. I do definitely see a major conflict between religion and technological change, because obviously religion is absolute. In the sense that we're right, you're wrong, our belief is right, your belief is wrong, and this is very close-minded, and I mean, I'm not a religious person in any sense. I respect people's right to believe in whatever they want to believe, of course, but I think that as time goes on, I think we will religions will be probably the largest they will be the antagonists, if you like, in a potential war with with the rest of us over technological change. In fact, one might say that the recent wars that we're having at the moment, jihadi wars that we're having at the moment, a lot of that is actually caused by the fact that these countries where these religions are based are often vastly undeveloped, and these poor people, suffer, greatly, whereby countries next door, who are reaping the rewards of technology, and so there's an obvious, reason why they would have a problem with that. I mean, if you were living next door to somebody who was eating a steak and all you had to eat was rice, you'd want to know why. But yeah, I mean, I think to answer your question, I hope, I think technological advance will heighten our ability to be more spiritual and become more one with ourselves and the universe.
Can you still hear me, or am my mic still on?
I'm sorry, say again?
I was just asking if my mic was still on because I wanted to respond.
Yes. Yes, yeah.
You know, when we're talking, I mean, you made a pretty bold statement about, you know, us living forever as humans.
No, not humans necessarily.
Well, and my take on that, and I find the more I experience life, the more I understand that a lot of the explanations of scientific things and even other religions are always most likely parallel to the belief. Whereas you're saying that there is a bounce against each other, I believe that it's because of our knowledge limitations that the people will not embrace the actual parallel to what you're talking. I happen to believe that I will live forever. My spirit will live forever. If you want to, you know, it depends on how you live your life and what, you know, utopia that you experience after your physical body, you know, expires.
Okay,
so
I understand.
If that makes any sense to you.
Yeah, but
when a person is, I think that when a person is asking a question is, you know, how is the AI going to allow us to live forever kind of thing, I think that there needs to be a clarification that, you know, I think we all know and need to accept that our physical bodies are going to expire, but we all, I think, agree that consciously we are going to, and even most religions will let you know that they're going to exist in heaven, or they're going to exist in whatever your conception is of the ever after, you know.
Okay,
and,
so if I can just interrupt you.
Sure.
I mean, obviously, every religion has, you know, their own idea of you know, an afterlife. You know, this is the main purpose of religion. But I mean, one of the things I can say to you is that we are, you know, we're going to transcend humanity. Okay, so humans are, you know, I think we're quite arrogant really as a species, because many of us believe that we're at the pinnacle of our evolution. You know, we have outstripped the majority of evolution based upon the simple fact that, you know, we're not in the same sort of survival of the fittest environment anymore. You know, there are certain factors, but obviously from a nature point of view, you know, it doesn't seem to operate at the same for us anymore. But we're entering a time now where we're able to accelerate our own evolution. Now, so for example, the Neanderthal who existed, you know, all those years ago, you know, before.
If you subscribe to that theory, yes.
Well, I mean, if you know, there is okay. So first of all, we need to yeah. Well, yeah, we shouldn't go there, but you know, we have a fossil record. I mean, we do know there are certain facts, and you know, we have you know, complete you know, bones you know, of Neanderthals, and you know, the idea that, you know, in fact there's even within us, there is elements of Neanderthals. They you know, we have DNA, which is, there's parts of Neanderthal DNA within us, and this is actually because we many years ago bred with Neanderthals, you know, and so Neanderthals obviously disappeared, you know, but they live on within us to a degree. You know, they're part of us, and I think that when we merge with technology, you know, technology is going to end up inside of us, and we will merge with technology, and it's a very big question. You know, at what point do we cease to be human? So, you know, what does it actually mean to be human? What classification? So, I mean, the classic idea of if you're a cyborg, if you've lost your legs terribly in an accident and they replace them with, prostheses, are you still human? I would think so. If you lost, more of you, how much more do they replace before you stop being human, right? So, and this is a big question as well. So there isn't a defining line, I think, and I think often when people refer to the question of what it is to be human, they start talking about what it is to be conscious and what it is to be self-aware, and so consciousness and self-awareness is an interesting thing because consciousness, my personal view, exists omnipresently around, it's part of the universe, okay? It's in everything, inanimate objects as well. It manifests as an inanimate object, but the difference between an inanimate object and something which can feel and experience is intelligence and a system of sensory inputs and outputs, and so very much like an artificial intelligence, neural network, and so therefore, if you take a neural network and you give it enough intelligence, then it can become self-aware, and if it becomes self-aware, it can embody its consciousness and realize it's conscious. And I think that religion is going to have a very, very difficult time with that, because religion's principle is that humans, have a soul, and that soul will, ascend to heaven or descend to hell, or some analog of that. So when machine consciousness can actually start asking some of these questions that you're asking me, themselves, religion, I think, is going to have a very difficult time of that. And I respect, by the way, totally your right to believe in whatever you want. I don't agree.
Well, if you allow me to say my final statement, sure. And that is, my religion dictates to me that I see through a glass darkly, which it translates into I don't know everything, and my Creator does know how things are. So that prevents me from speaking in absolutes, and I would encourage anyone that's exploring their philosophies and their scientific, that they all maintain that they are still human and they're still fallible, and that would be a good subscription for anyone that is exploring their own knowledge, which knowledge is dime a dozen. We can all gain knowledge from everything. My religion dictates that I could sit here and learn from you all kinds of knowledge, but without the wisdom in knowing how to exercise that knowledge, it's all worthless. So in that, I would say that I like the fact that I don't know everything, and I would encourage anyone that is exploring whatever it is, knowledge that is exploring, that they always should maintain that they don't know everything, and to be careful to speak in absolutes, because that, you could always find the pie in the face, so to speak, so, and I've had that happen to me many times, so, anyway, that's all I needed to say.
And what about if we are a virtual AI product of a different human mankind?
Sorry, can you say that again, please?
So if we are a virtual AI product of a different human mankind?
Possibly, yeah. That's the simulation hypothesis. Nick Bostrom, very, very clever guy, British guy. I know he's British. I'm not sure he's British actually. But anyway, he postulated that given our current technological advance, that we're able to create simulations, and that looking and tracking back, in the 1980s, we could create simulations, and that moving forward through time, that the simulations were getting progressively better on an exponential scale, and that eventually that we would get to a point where we will create simulations that are indistinguishable from reality. And in fact, that we wouldn't just create one. It's likely that we would create, many simulations, and so therefore, if that is true, then the chances are that the base simulation, of us being in reality, would be, exponentially slim, billions against. It's a simulation hypothesis, and it still could be true. There is a number of indicators that sort of follow that through. There's within quantum code, particularly looking at the universe in a quantized way, they found that there is a kind of within the math there seems to be kind of a parity check kind of code, which is used obviously to moderate and ensure that packets of data sent around the internet is correct. And so there are indications that potentially that could be the case. In fact, I was reading the other day, I'm not sure where, but they were looking at ways in which we could identify whether we're in a simulation or not. But the argument is that we could never know for sure because we're inside the simulation. So if we were inside the simulation, then everything that happens here could be the proviso of people outside the simulation. So therefore, we could never know for sure whether this was a simulation or not.
That is some deep thinking.
It is a possibility, though, and we shouldn't discount it. But anyway, we have somebody else sticking the hand up over here. So hello, you again.
Hey, thank you for your conversation. I'm going to have to go. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome.
There's a lot of wise words going around here now, and it was a lot of fun to listen to.
Good.
When it comes to what do you call it now again?
The technological singularity?
No, this what we just talked about.
Oh, simulation hypothesis.
Yeah. The thing about that is, it's a really bad thing because it's just another religion. I think we have enough religions. It's a hypothesis that could work, but it's just another explanation of something we don't understand and know.
Yeah.
So it is going in that direction for scientists. It's like,
Well, there are some problems with it. No, it's understandable. Yeah, it's understandable. Yeah, there are some, but just if you just bear with me, there just to reassure you, I mean that there are some problems with the simulation hypothesis, and namely it's energy, right? Because if you have a simulation which is indistinguishable from reality, and we're in it, and our natural progression is to create a simulation which is indistinguishable from reality, and then you're looking at a computational problem of infinity and an energy requirement of infinity, and so there must be either a closed loop situation where it's rather than being a forever, but I get what you're saying. What essentially, and this is the case with a lot of theoretical physics as well, by the way. I mean, an example is string theory and M theory, which ultimately states that our universe is on a membrane, and the Big Bang is caused when two membranes collide, and this causes the quantum fluctuations which give rise to the Big Bang, and these are all very interesting thoughts, and there are mathematics behind them, there are models behind them which actually back this up. But what you've got to understand here is, particularly with theoretical physics, is that often, I mean, particularly if we look at the standard model, the standard model of physics is ultimately what is the consensus for the rules and the laws of physics, but it doesn't quite work when you start looking at empirical data. There are areas that say, okay, well, it predicts this, but actually when you look at it, it doesn't really predict that. It doesn't really hold true. And so then they have to create whole new branches of mathematics to try and explain it. And it basically, the standard model is very much like a jigsaw puzzle, where the math is like the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, but when they all fit together, but when you look at the jigsaw, the actual picture, it's all messed up. It doesn't make any sense. And so, and unfortunately, I don't want to take a pop necessarily at the scientific establishment, but the scientific establishment is run on consensus. So if you have a very good idea, but it is in contradiction to, an eminent physicist, you will be shot down, regardless of whether that is a solution to a major, piece of physics. It won't see the light of day, which is a great shame, and it's the biggest problem that we've got with physics today. So an example is the Higgs field and the Higgs boson, which was supposedly discovered by CERN, and there are maths to back this up. But actually, when you look at the math and you look at the study, what they found doesn't really add up to what the Higgs is. And in fact, looking at the Higgs itself and the whole boson structure versus quantum gravity, they don't add up. And so we know that quantum gravity potentially is the theory of everything ultimately, because it shows how matter arises from nothing essentially. And so we have that kind of granularity of understanding, but it is incompatible with the standard model. So it gets buried and isn't given the kind of time of day. It has gradually through the last few years started to be accepted by mainstream physicists. But the reason I'm saying all of this is because you have this quasi philosophical area of theoretical physics, whereby there is science which is leading us to the same kinds of conclusions that religion has been alluding to, whereby the nature of consciousness and these kinds of questions about reality that philosophy has been trying to answer for millennia. These kinds of things are now becoming the area of physics, and that's often very hard for very straight physicists to cope with, because as a scientist we like very quantized data, no pun intended, very definite answers. And some people say that because we're now talking in the realms of universes having consciousness and things like that as a result of quantum gravity, that's not science at all, because we can't test it. And if it's untestable, is it science? So there's a lot of problems with addressing and our own ability to understand that. I think we only have a certain capacity in ourselves as humans, and I think that as we increase our own ability to computate within ourselves through the use of artificial intelligence, I think some of these really big questions we're going to start to get some answers on.
Yeah, that's where I think the future is artificial intelligence, because our problem today, I think, is that I think there's a really great theory out there that is a lot better than the one we have now, that is actually both written down and everything. It's just that it hasn't been approved by the right people. And and the thing is that because I think actually there's too much wrong with the current theory, and there's too much that doesn't fit, and other theories have to get so far to get to a level where they can explain as much as the other theory, that no theory today, no matter how good it potentially is in the background, can overcome the current theory, which I think is more or less wrong. Even most scientists think it's wrong, because they say that we try to solve it now, but it's there's too much that doesn't work. So, but the thing is, I think that artificial intelligence is going to look at the whole picture one day, and then they're just going to laugh at us and say, no, this is how it works.
Yes, well, I mean, I don't think they'll necessarily laugh, but I do think they'll think you know, that it's funny that you know how they know what they know and we didn't. But I mean, I think the primary difference is if we look at history, you know, people, you know, 2,000 years ago, people often think that they weren't very clever, but actually they were just as, you know, they had the capacity to be just as intelligent as we are today. It's just that they didn't have knowledge. I think the primary difference of tomorrow is that people will have access to an increased amount of intelligence. So it won't just be access to a vast amount of knowledge, but they'll also have a much higher ability to understand and computate and deal with large sets of information. But if I may,
But just one thing is that it's the difference I think is by artificial intelligence is the bias that is going to disappear. So that is what I think is so important about.
What do you mean bias?
Artificial intelligence.
Yeah, but what do you mean by bias?
Yeah, they don't have a bias. They don't assume things based on what previously have been learned. They've learned. It's not.
Okay, that's true. Yeah, right. So if I can answer this, this is going to be really interesting to you. So as you can see from the board behind me, at the bottom right hand, there's the name SingularityNET, and above me at the top there, you can see that big infinity sign. That's actually the symbol for SingularityNET. Now, SingularityNET is effectively offering and creating a decentralized, democratized market for AI. Okay, so at the moment, and this is relevant, I'll tell you for why. But at the moment, there really isn't a marketplace that can offer different AI to the market. It's a preserve of large companies that have you know, bottomless pits of money to invest in development and research and on AI, such as you know, Amazon and you know, Google and the large companies. What SingularityNET? SingularityNET has you know, the same kind of resources in terms of knowledge base as these companies, but what they're doing is they're building a decentralized and democratized market for AI. So what that means is rather than it being you know, a business-led centralized market for financial gain, what this is it's a free market where anybody who's developing an AI can place their AI onto the market, and anybody around the world, any business can buy that AI and use it. Okay. Now, why is this important? Well, because not only are they offering this, or going to be offering this, this is what they're in development at the moment, it's still in alpha, but they're creating a protocol, right, for AI, which is specifically, we're hoping it's going to be standardized as the primary protocol for AI, which basically what it means is that if you developed an AI, you could wrap that AI in the SingularityNET API, which is a piece of software that your AI can be embedded in, and that piece of software will allow that AI to interact with all of the other AIs that are on the market. Okay, so if at the moment narrow AI, which is what you're talking about, AI is narrow, even though we have machine learning, which you know, can be quite powerful in terms of the abilities that it can give. You know, it takes you can take an AI and make it extremely good at one or two things, but it doesn't really have the ability to learn. It's not general in its way of learning. It has a way to learn based upon a certain set of circumstances which you set on the outset, and then off it goes and learns those things and does it very well. But it doesn't have the ability to think as you or I would. I mean, I gave the example last week that, you know, a narrow AI that has been told to get from a location A to B, but there's an obstacle in the way, may learn that there's an obstacle in the way and that it has legs, and the best way to get around it is to jump over it. But an artificial general intelligence may think more like you or I and realize that the way that the object is made out of cardboard, for example, and could be moved out the way quite easily or walked straight through without even any effort. You know, those kinds of thoughts and feelings, and not necessarily feelings quite yet, but those kinds of thoughts, you know, are the preserve of what's called an artificial general intelligence. Okay, so SingularityNET, not only are they, you know, offering a democratized and decentralized open market for AI services to the world, but also that they're creating a situation whereby it is the ideal environment for an emergent AGI to form, where you know, whole swarms, multiple AIs can work together to think in a very generalistic way. So you know, narrow AIs that have very big specialisms and only do one or two things, but can communicate with, you know, millions of other AIs that have their own specialisms, and then from that emerges a general intelligence, and that's really where we're trying to get to, and that's what SingularityNet is trying to achieve. So yeah, if I was you, if you want to, you guys need to go to SingularityNET.io. So I should have really put that on the slide. I'm sorry about that. I should have done that. So yeah, but if you go to SingularityNET.io, that's, you'll get most of the information about that. We have a Telegram group, and there's a forum, community forum on there as well. So it's really a great place for you to ask those kinds of questions as well. If you get on Telegram, by the way, you can message me. That's my Telegram, and if you want to, you can email me as well, and I can help you out that way. Does anybody? It's now 10:10. Does anybody else have any questions? Just before we close this down. No? Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming again, and we look forward to seeing you again. The next one hopefully will be on the 16th of July on a Monday, and but I will be sending out, and I'll set the thing up with Altspace, and you'll be able to see it on the featured. So thanks very much, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you.
All the best.